I'm here to talk about my day job at the moment, so which is really not, just not as heavily related to, shall we say, medieval philosophy as we would all like, but there will be some fun elements in there, and I think that there are some reasons that for fragments to be interesting. So as Dragos mentioned, since October 2016, I have been in Fribourg as the project manager of the Fragmentarium project. This is directed by Professor Christoph Flüler, who also presented the project actually last year in Dublin. So it's nice for our project to be back there again. A few pieces of what I want to talk about today. I'll talk briefly about, I'll give what I'm talking about when I'm talking about manuscript fragments, some sorts of typologies of them. We'll go into a bit on the discipline of what we call now fragmentology, and then I'll present the project Fragmentarium. So that's my division of the theme. When I'm talking about fragments today, I just want to be absolutely clear, I'm talking about physical fragments of manuscripts. So this is opposed to text fragments, citation fragments, you know, what we use to talk about the pre-Socratics. Instead, I'm talking about physical pieces of manuscripts. And in particular, since you know my specialty, I work with Latin manuscript fragments. And we have a bit of a problem in the field of defining exactly what we mean by fragments. And this was a blog post by renowned scholar Peter Kidd, who had some questions and proposed a typology of fragments. And his typology there, as you can sort of see, he wants to talk about bits of manuscripts in terms of what they were used for, when they came from, how they're studied, and what disciplines study them. So he wants fragments, cuttings, and leaves. And well, I'm thinking about it, and you know, unfortunately, as professional deformations, you can say we see that fragments can be said in many ways. And when we look at these things, like here is a nice fragment from Leipzig, we talk about, in fact, what fragments are according to three basic typologies. And the first one is the most generic one, where it comes from. This determines more or less the actual, shall we say, disciplines and fields of interest that address these items. The second one is basically how we can discuss what things actually are. We can get a concrete description of them. And then the last one is more towards the analysis side, but leads back to how it was fragmented and the questions of fragmentation, which can be what's really interesting. Now, I'm going to be giving examples in here, and I want to also warn you that I will try to bring in occasionally some stuff from my work, so the 14th century Scotists won't be entirely disappointed. First off, where it comes from, in this case, I simply mean we're talking about script and period of production, since you know, the particular script, whether you know Hebrew, Latin script, Greek script, they tend to have their own periodizations and fields of interest, and for that matter, phenomena of fragmentation. So this is the most basic level, and this is the level at which I say we work with primarily Latin manuscript fragments. In secondary level, we do have some you know, medieval fragments from Greek fragments, Hebrew fragments, and some Arabic, but our focus is really on the Latin stuff. When we talk about what our Latin fragments are now, I think we have four basic categories, which I can show you. One is you can find these things bound in volumes. On the left there is, I believe that's the Virgilius Sangallensis. So 5th century Virgil, which was collected from other book bindings and put together in a volume in St. Gall, one of a series of volumes by an early 19th century librarian. So we have some guard volumes or fragment volumes. On the right here, you have a early 20th century example of Grangerization, where in this case, they're putting leaves into a book. In this case, as illustrations here, you have this chapter on manuscripts and miniatures, and Mr. Lewis at the Free, which is now the collection of Free Library of Philadelphia, put a piece in there. Other big category for us in fragments is in situ. Now we're getting towards the idea of fragmentation and why people are taking books apart. And it's basically, for some reason or other, the value of the object as a bearer of text in itself becomes less than its value for some other role. And parchment is good, durable stuff. You can make lampshades out of it. You can make, this is a famous case. I think this is Arne Magnusson's famous, I think 18th century Scandinavian fragmentologist found this fragment in a bishop's mitre. But more traditionally, you find in situ fragments in the bindings of books, because it's generally parchment is good, hard stuff you can use to put other books together. So that's the third group. The fourth group are the loose leaves or loose fragments, the ones that are often in, every library has a big box of these, it seems like, and some have several boxes. I think at the Archives Nationales in Paris, they have something like 20 boxes of 1,000 fragments each that was collected in like 1925. So there's a whole bunch of this material out here. There's also cases like this one here, which is a leaf that was cut out of a book and used on the market. I'll get back to that later, but in this general loose group, we have what are known as cuttings, which are usually details such as miniatures that are cut out and either pasted elsewhere, kept loose, used on birthday party invitations or whatever. And these are a group of fragments for us. Our last major group, so we had we had fragments in volumes, fragments that are in situ, fragments that are loose, and then finally we have the damaged ones. These are from any number of depredations. In this particular case, this is from a B-26 Marauder that dropped a stick over the center of Chartres in 1944 and killed a lot of people and burned the library. So finally, our last group, this is where we do the analysis, is how things are fragmented and why things are fragmented. And the number one way I've already alluded to is manuscript waste. When the manuscript is obsolete, or the book or whatever it is, the pages can be reused. Parchment is really good for this, but paper can also be used. I tried to get a good picture of manuscript waste, but all I could find was this 1751 Hogarth illustration of the virtuous beer street. Here, Hogarth was this 18th century English artist, and he wanted to portray the evils of gin and the virtue of beer. So in the beer one here, he did this, but in the corner, you have here a pile of books, and a summary of this illustration from 50 years later explains this image as, here we behold a parcel of healthy and happy beings regaling themselves with copious draughts of a liquor which seems perfectly congenial to their mental and corporeal powers. And then later on it says, on the right, a city porter has set down his load upon the ground in order to revive his spirits with a comfortable draught. His load consists of a parcel of books consigned to Mr. Pastem, the trunk maker, in St. Paul's churchyard. They are considered as waste paper from the names of their authors, etc. And basically, these are the books that Hogarth didn't like, so he put them out there for recycling. And this is a practice that continues, clear through the 18th, 19th century. And it means as well that whenever you're looking at early print books up to ones that are bound up to the mid 17th century, and then if you look in the bindings, I mean, you look in the spines, you can even find stuff much later, you're going to be dealing with medieval manuscript fragments. So that's one big group. The next big group of ways that things are fragmented is what we call broken books. This happens still today. This is from today's eBay. You'll see that Tuscany Books here is selling several pages of a rare dated paper manuscript leaf in Dutch. All of these have 19 lines per page. And so in this case, what happens is you buy a book, you buy a manuscript, it costs a certain amount of money, and you can make a lot more money by tearing the book apart and selling off the individual leaves. And so people do this, and it's been a practice for the last over a century. So that's a major source. And finally, you have remnants. I'm sorry this slide didn't come out, but it doesn't really matter. It wasn't very pretty anyway. In this case, remnants are again like the case for Chartres, or one of the example I had here was a drawing by Pierre Chambier-Prota of a manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris, one of the Belouz manuscripts, in which Belouz got some quires from a book that had been in Lyon since the 9th century, and sometime around the Reformation was broken up, and bits and pieces of it, quires, got separated and floated around. So we have these remnants are quite common. So a consequence here of this sort of typology, when we start saying that ultimately we're interested in things like phenomena of fragmentation, if we go and look at a whole bunch of book bindings for fragments, we're going to find things that aren't fragments, like ephemera. This is a parchment slip from a candle, but you find all kinds of other things in there that were not meant to be preserved, but because the object got reused, it continues. So that's one case. Another case is, well, we also find charters, and we have to deal with them as well. And this, by the way, is the original. This papal bull was the first binding of the 1336 or so catalog of the Bibliothèque de la Sorbonne. So when they did their first inventory, it was bound in this papal bull. And interestingly enough, this papal bull here is dated 1308, and it is to award a prebend to Franciscus Caracciolo, who subsequently in 1309 becomes the chancellor of the University of Paris. And this is the first documentary evidence that we have of Francis, and it was just stuck in, it was just used to wrap a catalog. So, all right, that's some of our consequences. So that brings us to fragmentology, as we try to look at manuscript fragments and consider it as a discipline of study. Now we can talk about whether it's a valid way to look at things, but that's one of the things that we are trying to do is defend the notion that there is a field or subfield of manuscript studies that looks at manuscript fragments. And I just will now start with the uses of fragments and where they go. The first and most obvious one to all of you, of course, is that they're witnesses of the text. This is fairly clear. We'll go to that in a second here and talk about individual cases. We can also start thinking about, when we find these pieces of the same manuscript, we can start thinking about how we can reconstruct them and bring these books back together. We can also look at studying the phenomenon of fragmentation. I already talked about a bit about that, but we'll get some more of what it actually means to fragment and what this means for the survival of texts. And then that leads to the ability to take entire corpora and study them systematically and arrive at new conclusions about our past and from this fairly overlooked source. Okay, so let's go on. First of all, fragments as witnesses. Now, I just wanted to give a personal example from many years ago when I first came to Fribourg. I came to work on the critical edition of Francis and Markia's commentary on Book 2 of the Sentences. And when I showed up, the team had already made a selection of the manuscripts to retain, and Jerry Etzkorn had prepared an elaborate stemma of all the witnesses. So we had this to do, and we started on this edition, and this is one of the manuscripts here. This is a manuscript from Prague, actually. This is in the castle now. And we retained this one, and I had some trouble because at the end of this, we published the volumes separately as the project went along, one of the requirements for the funding. So when I had to write the introduction to the first volume, I had to write the introduction to the edition part and explaining the stemma, which I couldn't because I hadn't done it. And Russ told me that Russ Friedman told me that I'd have to deal with that in the third volume. But I did try to describe the manuscripts. And this manuscript here was a bit of a problem because there was a minor redaction related to the edition that we were making, which I called DH. And I could tell from our collations that P was contaminating with this other redaction, particularly when I had trouble. But I didn't, know much more than that. Well, fortunately, for volume 3, I got to go back and actually redo the work that was done at the beginning with the wisdom of the edition behind us. And one of the things I found was that the original soundings that were done by Jerry Etzkorn and Cameron Porter in the summer of 2005 were done from various parts of Book 2 of the Sentences, but also were done to avoid using fragments. In fact, he said, we're just throwing the fragments out. So when I went and started collating against what was basically a remnant, there's a fragment here of the last, like the last 6 of the 48 questions. And it's, it begins at, I think you can maybe be able to read it there, but it begins at around folio 68 or 69 out of, so you're missing the whole first part of this. This is Milan manuscript. I saw this. And if you look closely, you can see that someone has gone in here and made corrections to it. And those corrections map against the other redaction. So here is somebody who has made a copy of the major redaction in this particular passage, and then makes corrections from this earlier redaction to fix the sense. And not only that, the collation is such that it's clear that the Prague manuscript is a copy of this. So by simply ignoring fragments and as a witness, this important detailed transmission, this would have saved us a lot of trouble if someone had done this at the beginning. And I could even tell, in some cases, this is fun for your for the philology part, that corrections flew both ways. Here is Prague, who writes at one point in here, quando cumque, and corrects it to quantum cumque, which is for the sense. And if you go back, if you look at the Milano, the Milano manuscript, it originally had a quando cumque, which somebody then adds in. You can't really see it well in this microfilm, but it's somebody adds in an extra stroke and corrects it to quantum cumque. So what happens here, I think, is a copyist is going along, figures out that this is not the right word, writes the correct word, and then goes and corrects his exemplar. So anyway, so this is just an example of, you know, the importance of fragments in our daily lives. And even if you have 18 manuscript witnesses, you can't just exclude the fragmentary ones as being of too little value to pay attention to. So that's, you know, one example of witnesses. I'm sure we can talk about other ones that we've encountered. For virtual reconstructions, as I mentioned, we had the possibility to bring these leaves back together. And one of the cases here I have on Fragmentarium, you can see, is a missile that has been given the name the Beauvais missile. In fact, you know, and we have reconstruction from libraries all over the world. How did this one get spread out so much? Well, over here you can see the guy named Ege Otto Fragmentator. What happens is, and this gets to our phenomena of fragmentation, here we have this article, I Am a Biblioclast by Otto Ege. Otto Ege was, here we have somebody who in the middle of the 20th century in the United States, a professor at Cleveland who specialized in, had an interest in calligraphy. What he did was he bought a bunch of medieval manuscript books, tore them apart, and sold to libraries around the world, particularly in North America, collections of 50 original manuscript leaves, medieval manuscript leaves, as samples for people, as samples for study by calligraphy students. So for many of us from North America, our first experience of learning paleography was via fragments. So we can, so one of the things we talk about phenomenal fragmentation is, well, what are the motivations for this? What's the history of the practice? And, you know, I give a couple of fairly recent examples, that's one. And then that even brings us into fragments or non-fragments in the current book market. Like what you're seeing here on the right, for example, is something that I found for sale a couple of years ago for the price of 60,000 euros by a certain bookseller in Basel. And it purports to be a tree of consanguinity. But it's a fake. And this is the original here from the Fondation Martin Bodmer. And we pretty much discovered, you know, by looking at these things, that a whole history for new kinds of manuscript forgeries that are coming in now. And you can see when we went back and looked at this other manuscript here, this tree of consanguinity, we discovered that it had been mutilated. So, and I'll get to a bit of explanation of what happened here. This piece has been mutilated, and you can see here on the right, will blow up at the bottom right corner, where you have the pro prior there, and then you can see it's been cut and pasted over. And then if you look at the forgery, you can see that there's nothing there, but rather this meaningless abbreviation is stuck on top of, you know, who knows what that is. Well, here's what happened, all right? The full story is that this, there was a French bookseller in the 1950s who had a Bible that he had trouble moving, and he finally sold this nice Bible to Martin Bodmer, who was a collector of medieval manuscripts. And I don't know why, perhaps to sweeten the deal, he put in the front of this Bible a legal text, and this is, I think the text is this is a a treatise on the forbidden degrees of marriage and how to calculate them for consanguinity and affinity. And so this particular tree with the gentleman there and the egg, you know, this face in the middle is the ego, and then these are all the people that you're not allowed to marry. And then this text sort of explains that. Now, this text was more or less complete, but being a legal manuscript, its dimensions were somewhat longer than the Bible that it was going to go into. So the bookseller, we think it was a bookseller, cut out 10 lines here at the bottom and then pasted the back, what was left back on there, so that it would fit and match the dimensions of the Bible. And then that went into the Bodmer collection. It was then digitized by eCodices, the people next door here, in 2010 and put online. And then somebody in the United States happened to come into some small pieces of parchment and had an idea of, well, why don't I print myself up some medieval Bible leaves? So he went and took 2 Bible manuscripts from eCodices, this being one of them, and print out a couple of pretty pages. And he'd print them out. What he did is he took a mask and he masked out all the color and just kept the ink and printed the ink on a small piece of parchment, and then drew in by hand this ugly little bastard here and used silver instead of gold and all that. So that is, and then he sold it all on eBay for a small price. A collector in Le Mans bought some, a collector in England bought some, and then they both resold it to a prestigious auction house in Paris, and the rest is history. So what does all this tell us about the phenomena of fragmentation and fragmentology? Well, manuscript fragments are becoming increasingly big business, and when we actually look and study the history of these things, they can be quite fascinating. But let me get to a more fun case and something more fun. When we talk about manuscripts and when they're being recycled, like in the case of someone going and picking the Bible pages because they will sell for the highest, there's a question of selection. And when we talk about in situ manuscript fragments, the ones that are being used for for bindings of books, they're usually selected because they are judged to be useless or ugly or broken in some way. So useless is the case for a lot of, for example, liturgical texts. When the liturgy changes, as it does, your old books go out of fashion and you have to change them. When you have ugly stuff, and this is where it's as philosophers, we have to deal with a lot of ugly manuscripts. This, ends up there. And this is something actually, I owe Garrett, I think, an article on this one. This is a Dominican, this is from the Dominican library in Frankfurt. It's now in I think it's the University Library. It says here at the bottom. Anyway, it's, oops, sorry, excuse me. Let me go back up. And what this is this is what I believe to be an autograph of William of Ware's commentary in the sentences. And there's about 40 different pieces of this that are stuck in incunabula in the Frankfurt Library. And the reason why I think it's autograph as well, the corrections are never, are rarely filling errors, are usually additions of text and observations. And you see the pen changes happen at questions, at the beginnings of questions, which suggests that somebody's copying this as it comes along. So it's an interesting and fun text to play with. And if you're working with, if you're working with liturgical texts, you'll find them in situ fragments. But if you're working with things like grammars or logics, the stuff that usually is taught early on to students, so you have these texts that are read by a lot of teenage boys, they tend to wear out and be bound into books. So this is where you can find some fun things. So that's, and this is another aspect of what we're doing with fragmentology is looking at these big collections and trying to determine what actually gets reused and why. And that brings us to the systematic study of fragments. If we start looking at entire collections, we can go from these individual cases of individual manuscripts and witnesses and reconstructions and go to the level of entire libraries, entire communities. And there are parts of Europe, like Scandinavia and Romania, where practically no medieval Latin manuscripts survive entire, but the fragments are still there. And by going through and looking at them in a systematic way, we can start to reconstruct not just the liturgy of the region and the manuscript hands, but also the contents of the libraries. And so this is sort of the fun and the challenge of it. So one of our points that we wanted to have was that we thought we could argue that fragmentology should be considered a bit of a discipline of its own for these reasons. We've got a material that's fairly unique. We have this phenomena of fragmentation that relates to all of what we're doing, and we want to reach conclusions that are complementary to, shall we say, more traditional manuscript studies. And we have also the advantage now of technology that allows us to do this. Interoperable technology, like you could see for the virtual reconstructions, we can bring images of manuscripts from around the world into an application and show the book whole as it was before. Digitization has made everything a lot easier, but also, I should point out that what really also helps are search engines and all our text databases that are there, because when at the in the pre-formation of the project, before any of this started, there was a Professor Christoph Mackert at the University Library of Leipzig in the Manuscript Center there, applied for DFG funding for a project to work on fragments. And he got the response then from the German National Research Fund that rather they were not supporting digitization and description projects for fragments because they took way too much work compared to entire manuscripts. So they were going to favor manuscript books. And you can understand 20 years ago, that was the case. You have this thing here, this termite-eaten decaying book of Italian poetry with something that looks like a humanist hand stuck in the binding. And this was found, I was up in Sao Leopoldo just before the SIPM conference in Porto Alegre, looking at this. And 20 years ago, what are you going to do with this? You have a little bit of words and you have to really know your sources to identify the text. And now we can actually do a better job of identifying it. So it's Plutarch, Philopomen, it's probably early 15th century humanist copy. And you can even reconstruct what we have of the page from this and show that, yes, indeed, that's a text. So what the tables have turned, whereas before to describe a fragment would take more work to identify the sources and to do all the material compared to describing the whole manuscript book. Now it's the other way around. We can describe fragments fast and we can digitize them. They're only a couple pages usually, much easier and cheaper than entire books. So from this intuition was born the Fragmentarium project. This is our main page right now, fragmentarium.ms. And that brings us to the third part of my little talk, which is the project history of Fragmentarium and what it is that we are actually doing. So what are we doing? Well, here's a basic history. How do you get something like this together? Well, there was a planning meeting in Geneva, and there's a picture of it here. What happened was the director of the project, Christoph Fuller, was director of eCodices and had a bit of a reputation in the digital library world. So he invited to Geneva to talk the heads of manuscript sections of libraries, along with researchers who were specialists in fragments, and even important private collectors, to talk about the proposal of building this big laboratory. And you bring people out for a couple of days to a nice place and put them up in a 5-star hotel and give them nice food to eat. At the end of it, they were very much in favor of this. So we had a project that began in June of 2015. This was before I got here. So they started to build an application. And then they had a series of workshops. I came in October 2016. And so in 2017, on September 1st, we launched the website. This is what it looked like. We had about 367 manuscript fragments. And we launched in St. Gall, and since then we've been growing. I've plotted year after year, and I have to plot this year the growth of the project in terms of current and planned collaborations. You can see Europe is growing. This is last year already. It's changed. We've added quite a few more. And then around the world, that's also going, and we've also got several more coming up. So the project's been expanding, and we currently have over 150 collections represented in our database, and our current count is here: 1,525 published documents, another 3,500 in the system. There's about 1,000 of them from Stuttgart alone that are going to be published in the fall. So that's some numbers. We have a journal, which we call Fragmentology. So if you're publishing on manuscript fragments, by all means, contact me. It's not as big as Vivarium, thankfully. But unfortunately, I'm not getting rid of this at the end of the year. So, okay, so what was the impact of this? So when we, at the end of this, we had this first phase of the project that ran from 2015 to the end of 2019. And we started to look at what is the impact in terms of interest in the field. And to get an idea of this, I just went through the catalogs of the big international medieval conferences in Leeds and Kalamazoo for the last 20 years, and was able to plot the number of papers given on fragments and Manuscript. And you can see that fragments are sexy, so it's good to know about them. And then this brings us to where we are as of last year. We started the second phase. So what's going on now is we are building up, we're trying to build Fragmentarium as a center for fragmentology, for this discipline. And we're trying to do this by promoting, on the one hand, research, both early career and developed research. So we have fellowships for predominantly early career scholars, and we use primarily the fellowships are coming from the Zeno Karl Schindler Foundation. We have also the Stavros Niarchos Foundation is funding a more developed and prestigious project out of Paris, which we're going to have very soon, as soon as online very soon, as soon as the digitizations come in. We have multi-year research projects, so we coordinate with other scholars and teams around the world that get money for their fragment-related research. For the most part, these are publishing fragments. In some cases, there are also things like there's this database of medieval chant, and we work with them. So it's Cantus, and so that's we run workshops in which we bring people in to talk about fragments, and this is usually associated with the fellowships. We plan to have a summer school at some point. We routinely do these laboratories where we go into various digital humanities classes and have a 3-hour session of working with our database. The usual thing of giving seminars. We currently have, well, we were planning on having 4 cataloging courses this year. This is basically training people on our system. That's been scaled back a bit or rescheduled. I think we're even having one in Dublin, but yeah, I'll get the details on that. I'm not sure that's been announced yet. We keep our work in the e-journal. We want to have a little handbook, and we need to make our web platform sustainable so that this will last for well beyond the end of the project in 2022. So anyway, that's what I do when I'm not talking about SCOTUS. And I just wanted to thank you for your time. I hope that was useful. Thank you.